A look through this prism may be expanding. In a new study published in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, the state of our children's health is examined. Specifically, what is being studied are the trends in obesity in our children. And while some recent reports have suggested that some of these trends are reversing, the study led by Ashely Cockrell Skinner, an assistant professor of pediatrics at the University of North Carolina, suggests that for some, the problem is getting worse, especially amongst the heaviest of our children. Joining us to talk about obesity is Dr. Ashely Cockrell Skinner. Welcome.
Well, thank you.
Let's first start with the largest picture. What are we seeing in terms of obesity trends over the past 10, 20 years, especially in regards to children?
So what we're seeing in the time period we looked at was 14 years. And what we're seeing in terms of overweight and obesity is essentially a flat line, very little change amongst kids of any age.
Now, some people might take that as being a good sign that at least things aren't getting worse. But given some of the health problems associated with obesity and being overweight, I'm guessing that this is still cause for concern for you.
Well, it's definitely still a cause for concern. Of course, I do think it's a good thing that it is not getting worse. That's certainly something that is very important to see. One thing that is also important to realize is that among that group of kids who are obese, what may be happening is we know they're over a certain level, but we don't know just how high they are. And part of what we were able to show is that those in the most extreme levels of obesity, that does seem to be rising. So even though the overall rate is relatively steady, the actual how heavy the kids are within the highest groups may be worsening.
Okay, so if we look at the curve, the ends of the curve, the outliers seem to be having a significant effect within their own population.
Correct.
I want to go to the operational definition before we continue. How did you define obesity?
So we define obesity in kids based on percentiles. So almost any parent in the United States would be familiar with percentiles because they're the growth charts that we use for height, weight, and for BMI. So for overweight, it's if they're over the 85th percentile, and for obesity, it's if they're over the 95th percentile. We used being over 120% of the average weight for your peers and over 140% of the average weight for your peers for the higher levels of obesity. And that is a complicated definition, but it's very difficult because kids are always growing.
Well, it's also one that I wonder, is it problematic if the overall trend for weight in children is increasing, then that 50th percentile, which, say, 15 years ago, let's say was, 80 pounds for a child who's 10 years old, if it's 100 pounds now, he may not look like he's overweight. Do you adjust for that?
So actually we do. So what you say would be absolutely correct in the typical meaning of percentiles. But when I say percentiles and the growth charts, we made not we, but the field as a whole made a determination from charts in 2000, and so everything is based off of those charts. So it's actually the 85th percentile of kids from a cohort before the year 2000.
And you said that the trends seem to be relatively stable overall, but I wonder, are we seeing disparities in gender, race, SES as well?
So we always see disparities in sort of the total prevalence of obesity. I don't believe we're seeing any significant disparities in the changes in just standard levels of obesity. Everybody is increasing, even though particularly African American and Hispanics are at greater risk of being overweight in general.
That's interesting because recently I've been reading a number of studies which have been tying obesity to economics, suggesting that children who were in somewhat poorer households were eating less well, eating more processed foods, eating foods which tend to contribute to obesity.
Well, that is true, but these problems have been consistent for quite a long time, and I think we talk about it more recently because the recession has brought many of these issues to the forefront. But absolutely, poverty, other issues with living in an urban area or a poor urban neighborhood, these all make it more difficult to access healthy foods. But that's been true for quite a while.
And how many children did you look at? What is your N? What is the age range that you covered?
So we looked at the age ranges that we covered was ages 2 to 19. I'm trying to pull up the actual numbers of N. It's a very large N in general. We're looking at about 20,000 kids.
So we can be pretty confident of the statistical significance of your results.
So we can be confident. I mean, we do have to be cautious that when we look at, say, for example, only girls who are age 2 to 5, that sample size does start to get smaller. That said, it's still a relatively large sample and certainly the largest sample that we have with good data like this.
Now, we've already gone over one of the chief findings, which is that it seems that at the end of the curve, the children who were already obese seem to be getting even more so. What other findings did you make?
So I think that's certainly one of the more significant ones. I think that we also found that to be true primarily in younger girls, so elementary school-aged girls, and that we found that to be true in adolescent-aged boys. So those are really the groups that we seem to be seeing the greatest increase in these severe levels of obesity. I think another important thing that we didn't go into it intending to do is recently there's been a report of declines in obesity amongst preschoolers. And we didn't see that when we use a longer 14-year perspective compared to a recent CDC report.
Now, I don't know that you looked into this, but do we know the why? Is this largely an issue of nutrition, activity, genetics, or other factors?
So we didn't look into the why. I think that if you were to ask me to answer that, I would say it's all of those. I certainly think that we live in an environment that does not promote activity for children and does not promote healthy eating for children. I think that's why we continue to see high levels of obesity, and we have to change an awful lot of things in order to see that improving. That said, I think that's also part of the reason why we're seeing increases in some of the more severe levels of obesity. I believe there's probably kids who have genetic tendencies and are more vulnerable to this really bad food and health environment. And that may be why they're gaining weight even more than they might otherwise.
Now, I don't believe your study did, but are you aware of any other studies that look at obesity on a worldwide scale and compare how children are doing in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, et cetera, compared to what we're seeing here in the U.S.?
So I don't know off the top of my head. I do know that we see, certainly in European countries, we're seeing some of this increase or this sort of leveling off. We certainly aren't seeing improvements in obesity. Now, a lot of them don't have prevalence as high as the United States does, but I think we do continue to see this increase in obesity worldwide.
And do we see any mediating effects from health education, food education, or do they not seem to have enough penetration in large enough numbers?
So I think you've hit on exactly the issue there, that we have a lot of efforts, particularly in the U.S., and it's certainly something that parents and the media have focused on. That said, it's very hard to get enough penetration into the population. I mean, we are talking about a situation where over a third of the population is considered overweight amongst kids, even more, about double that amongst the adults. So education alone is not enough. We have to have education. It has to penetrate to a full population. We also have to have financial incentives and ability to, access healthier foods. We have to have environments that are structured for it, schools that are prepared for it. So I think this is the reason why, despite a lot of smaller efforts, they don't seem to come together to really make a big difference. And
if I were going to go to word association, because I'm not exactly sure how I want to attack this question. But if I were going to go to word association and say the words nanny state, how do you respond?
So I don't personally believe that these are all things that have to be government level. And I certainly don't believe that the government is even in a position necessarily to have the effect that they want. I think a lot of this is going to have to come from the ground up. So in communities where they recognize this as a problem, these communities are going to have to find ways to change their entire environment. That's not to say that there aren't large policies at state and federal government levels that could improve access to healthy food. I'm not an economist, so I couldn't tell you exactly what all of those are, but I do believe there are some ways that that could happen without being a nanny state, without actually telling people what to do, but finding ways to encourage and make more accessible healthy things.
Now, you mentioned the environment, and I'm probably going into a sphere which you're not aware of, and if you are, just let me know and we'll exit the question. But I wonder about the impact on overall obesity rates when we talk about the introduction of these hormones and GMOs and other things into our food supply. Do we know enough that there is a correlation between the two?
So I think we certainly know that there's a correlation between, in particular, some of the hormones that are introduced. I don't know about GMO foods, but when certain hormones and chemicals are introduced, there does seem to be a correlation with obesity. Whether that's a causation, we certainly don't have the research to demonstrate that. However, given that there is sort of this persistent increase and this persistent level of obesity, it does raise the question of whether there are things within the, water supply, food supply that alter the body's reaction to things. I'm certainly not an expert, and I can't say that there are. I think there's people who are trying to look into that, and I hope the research on that continues to move forward, because that will really help us understand ways that we can address the problem.
And to narrow it down to the really micro, to you and me, how do we address this? What can I do as a parent or a friend of someone with a child? What are some strategies you'd like to see me incorporate?
So in general, the strategies I always say are we don't talk about weight a whole lot because that's not our concern. Our concern is trying to be healthy. So we try to encourage healthy foods. We introduce a lot of different foods and different fruits and vegetables particularly. We engage in activity whenever possible. Now, I will say that for those kids who are at the most extreme levels of obesity, they are in a position where their physician might be able to help, not just in ensuring that they're healthy, which is one important thing, but there are some medically directed interventions that are used for the family to help them make healthy lifestyle changes that are very effective for these kids who are really severely overweight.
Now, I'm hearing a lot about food. Does that mean that the activity side of the equation is not as important, those 10,000 steps we're supposed to take every day?
So my personal belief is that, and I think this is somewhat backed up by research, is I think activity is probably more important. It's certainly easier to cut back 500 calories a day, I'm thinking in terms of an adult level here, as part of a diet than it is to engage in 500 additional calories worth of activity. That said, being active all along is just good for the metabolism. It's good for the body. And I have a lot of reason to believe that that plays a huge role in obesity. And another thing is there's a lot of kids in this country who eat really badly. Almost every kid does. So even though we know that overweight and obese kids may be eating more than their peers, there's also some evidence that they may really not be eating more, that it may really be driven by activity. It doesn't change the fact that all kids are eating pretty bad diets.
Looking at trends in obesity amongst America's children. I'm Andrew Hiller for The Prism on Radio VR, and I've been joined by Ashely Cockrell Skinner. She's an assistant professor of pediatrics at the University of North Carolina School of Medicine. Thank you so much.
Thank you.